Have you ever wondered why ancient humans crawled into pitch-black caves just to press their hands against the cold stone? You are standing in the absolute absence of light. Your eyes strain, fighting for shape and color, but there is nothing. The air around you is heavy, stale, and smells sharply of wet limestone and deep, rotting earth. The temperature drops, settling into a permanent, bone-chilling cold that seeps directly through your skin. Every breath you take feels thin. The deeper you go, the more the oxygen depletes, making your heart race and your lungs work twice as hard. Your only defense against this crushing, total blackness is a small, sputtering flame burning from a hollowed-out chunk of rock filled with melting animal fat. If that single flame blows out, you are miles underground. You are completely blind, surrounded by jagged drop-offs, dead ends, and narrow, suffocating tunnels that could easily become your tomb. Deep inside this underground nightmare, far beyond the furthest reach of the sun, the flickering light of your small fire hits a smooth section of the wall. There, glowing against the pale rock in the darkness, is a handprint outlined in a bright, blood-red pigment. It is a small hand. It is a child's handprint. The fingers are spread wide, pressed flat against the freezing stone, surrounded by a permanent halo of red ochre. To leave this mark, someone had to crush iron oxide into a fine powder. They had to mix that dry, bitter dust with their own saliva, gather it in their mouth, and forcefully blow it out in a deep, explosive exhalation over the child's resting hand. The crushed charcoal from their torches and the blown red pigment are now physically bonded to the cave wall. This is not just a painting. It is the breath, the saliva, and the physical outline of a human being who has been dead for 30,000 years. When modern people look at these images in history books or brightly lit museums, they see them perfectly illuminated. They imagine ancient humans casually drawing pictures on the walls of their comfortable homes. But the physical reality of the environment tells a completely different story. Archaeological evidence proves that ancient people did not live deep inside these cave systems. The air was too poor, the dampness was too severe, the darkness was too absolute. These deep zones were terrifying, oxygen-deprived spaces that humans deliberately chose to enter, knowing the sheer physical risks. They crawled through tight limestone tubes where they could barely turn their shoulders, dragging their fragile light with them into the unknown. We are taught that these cave walls were early art galleries, simple places where people doodled animals and shapes. But the truth of why they actually went down there and what they were desperately trying to achieve in the dark is much darker. When modern people think about cavemen, the image is almost always the same. A family sitting comfortably around a fire, wrapped in thick furs, roasting meat while someone casually doodles horses on the wall behind them. We treat these spaces like prehistoric living rooms. We assume the paintings were just ancient wallpaper created by bored hunters waiting for the snow to stop. But archaeological evidence completely destroys this cozy illusion. When researchers map these ancient cave systems, they find that human habitation is almost entirely restricted to the entrance. Ancient people lived at the mouth of the cave in the twilight zone, where the sun could still reach them and the smoke from their cooking fires could actually escape. If you try to build a large heating fire deep inside a closed limestone cavern, you will asphyxiate in minutes. The entrance was the camp. The entrance was safe. But the art is almost never at the entrance. To find the paintings and to find that child's red handprint, you have to leave the camp. You have to step out of the daylight and walk down into the belly of the earth. In some cave systems in France and Spain, the marked walls are located over a mile underground. Reaching them was not a casual stroll. It required crawling on your stomach through narrow, freezing rock tubes. It meant inching along slippery ledges suspended over massive, unseen drop-offs, listening to the sound of water dripping into black voids hundreds of feet below. This brings us to the brutal trade-off of the deep cave. In the ancient world, the most valuable resource on Earth was animal fat. Fat meant calories. Fat meant surviving the freezing winter. Fat was life. To venture miles underground, these humans had to build torches. They had to hollow out stones, fill them with marrow and animal fat, and burn it. They were literally burning their own food supply. They were willingly destroying the very calories they needed to survive the Ice Age, just to create a temporary bubble of light in a place they did not belong. And they did not go down there alone. The deep zones of these caves were the winter dens of Ice Age predators. Cave bears, which stood over 10 feet tall and weighed nearly a ton, slept in these black corridors. Cave lions dragged their kills down into the absolute darkness. In many of these caverns, scientists have found the massive, deep scratch marks of cave bears right beside the delicate red handprints of ancient humans. They knew the monsters were down there. They could smell the rotting musk of apex predators trapped in the damp air. If their fat lamp blew out, they would be swallowed by a darkness so complete that their eyes would never adjust. They would be unable to find their way out, left to freeze, starve, or be hunted by creatures built for the blackness. Yet, they went anyway. They crawled through the rock, they traded their food for light, risked hypothermia, and faced blind encounters with giant predators, all for the singular purpose of touching a blank wall. This was not primitive doodling. This was a deliberate, highly calculated mission into the underworld. But to understand why they took that terrifying risk, you have to understand the nightmare waiting for them on the surface. To truly grasp what drove them underground, you have to feel the environment that was trying to kill them on the surface. During the peak of the Ice Age, the world outside the cave was an endless, blinding expanse of white and gray. The wind did not just blow. It screamed across the plains, carrying sharp crystals of ice that could slice exposed skin. Temperatures plummeted so far below freezing that a human caught outside without heavy, oil-soaked hides would die of hypothermia in hours. The cold was a physical weight on the chest, making every breath feel like inhaling broken glass. In this brutal landscape, the sun was a weak, distant companion, and the nights were long, lethal, and owned by giant predators perfectly adapted to the frost. Fleeing into the earth offered a desperate escape from the freezing wind, but it replaced one kind of horror with another. As these ancient humans left the twilight of the cave entrance and walked deeper into the limestone arteries of the planet, the temperature stabilized, but the sensory world evaporated. Imagine the smell of this journey. The air grew thick and heavy, reeking of damp minerals, ancient bat guano, and the rotting musk of animals that had crawled down there to die. Above all, there was the suffocating, acrid stench of their own torches. They were not burning clean wood. They were burning crushed animal bones and thick lumps of horse or reindeer fat, which released a greasy, black smoke that coated their lungs and stung their eyes. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to what the deep cave did to the human mind. Modern science tells us exactly what happens when a person is subjected to total sensory deprivation. In the absolute silence and pitch black of a deep cavern, the human brain cannot handle the lack of input. It panics. Deprived of normal sight and sound, the brain begins to manufacture its own reality to fill the void. Within minutes, brain waves alter. Severe auditory and visual hallucinations take over. For the ancient humans walking miles underground, this meant their own nervous systems became sources of terror. The silence of the cave was so profound that the sound of their own heartbeat echoed in their ears like the slow, rhythmic footsteps of a massive predator. The blood rushing through their veins sounded like rushing water. When they stared into the blackness beyond their small, sputtering fat lamps, their starved optic nerves began firing randomly. They would see shapes shifting in the dark. The natural curves and bulges of the limestone walls would suddenly look like the muscular shoulders of a bison or the massive jaw of a cave bear lunging toward them. They were inhaling toxic smoke, shivering in the damp cold, and fighting a brain that was actively generating nightmares. It was an environment designed to trigger maximum human panic. Most modern people placed in that exact situation would drop to their knees in sheer terror, lose their sense of direction, and die in the dark. Yet, the humans of the Paleolithic era kept walking. They did not succumb to the madness of the sensory void. They fought through the hallucinations and the claustrophobia until they reached specific, hidden chambers deep inside the earth. And once they got there, amidst the panic and the shadows, they did not lose their minds. They executed something highly calculated. When you look closely at these deep cave systems, the most chilling evidence of human presence is not always the art itself. It is the scattered, microscopic debris of a desperate struggle to keep the lights on. Modern archaeologists exploring these miles-long tunnels do not just find colorful shapes on the ceiling, they find thousands of black streaks violently scraped along the limestone walls. These are known as torch wipes. When an ancient torch or a hollowed-out stone filled with animal fat began to suffocate under the thick buildup of its own ash, the flame would start to flicker and die, quickly plunging the human into creeping blackness. To save their light, the ancient explorer had to strike the burning end of their torch against the hard rock wall, knocking off the charred crust to expose fresh fuel to the oxygen. These black streaks tell a story of constant, low-level panic. By tracking these charcoal smears, researchers can trace the exact, frantic footsteps of people moving deeper and deeper into the earth, constantly fighting to keep their fragile fire alive. They were not casually exploring. They were managing a fragile life support system in a total vacuum of light. And when they finally reached their destination, they did not pull out a brush and calmly begin to paint. They used their own bodies as the primary piece of technology. When scientists analyze the chemical composition of the red ochre surrounding that small child's handprint, they do not just find mud, they find complex mineral recipes, and they find the biological signature of the artists themselves. To create the sharp, vivid halo of red around a resting hand, ancient humans utilized a brutal method that required them to physically ingest the earth. They took chunks of bitter, metallic iron oxide, which they sometimes painstakingly heated in surface fires to alter its chemical structure and deepen its red color, and crushed it into a fine powder. Then, they put that dry, toxic dust directly into their mouths. They had to chew the raw, gritty mineral, mixing it thoroughly with their own warm saliva until it formed a thick, metallic paste. Think about the physical sensation of that exact moment. You are miles underground. The air is freezing and thin. The shadows are violently jumping across the walls, fueled by your exhausted mind. You press your hand, or the hand of your child, flat against the freezing, wet limestone. Then, bringing your face just inches from the rock, you use your lips as an airbrush. You draw in a massive breath of the smoky air, and you forcefully blow the metallic paste out of your mouth, spraying it over the fingers and onto the stone. This required deep, forced exhalations. It was a physically exhausting process that left the lungs burning, but the result was entirely unique. They were not just leaving a painted mark on a surface. By blowing the pigment from their mouths, they were literally sealing their own saliva, their breath, and their DNA into the porous skin of the rock. The wall absorbed the biological moisture from their bodies, locking the iron oxide in place for tens of thousands of years. The human and the cave became physically fused. This extreme, uncomfortable technique proves that this act was intensely personal. They were willing to taste the bitter earth and exhaust their lungs in an environment where simply breathing was already a struggle. They did this because they understood something fundamental about the terrifying world they lived in. This was not just a picture of an animal, and it was not just art. It was a physical mechanism for survival. If you stood in front of these painted walls today with a bright, steady flashlight, you might actually be disappointed. Many of the most famous animal drawings in these deep caves look chaotic. You will see a massive bison with 8 legs. You will see a woolly rhinoceros with multiple overlapping horns, or a wild horse with 3 heads drawn one over the other. For a long time, modern people assumed this was just primitive clumsiness. We thought they were just drawing over old mistakes or reusing the same patch of rock because they ran out of space. But modern researchers realized we were looking at the walls the wrong way. We were looking at them with steady, artificial light. When archaeologists returned to the caves and turned off their modern equipment, lighting the original chambers with only the violently flickering flames of animal fat lamps, the chaos on the walls suddenly made sense. The overlapping lines were not mistakes. They were strictly intentional. As the ancient humans moved their torches back and forth, the shifting shadows played across the natural, bulging curves of the limestone. In the dancing, unstable light, the 8-legged bison appeared to be running. The rhinoceros looked like it was tossing its heavy head. The wild horses seemed to be galloping in the dark. This was Paleolithic animation. Ancient people were purposely using the 3-dimensional shapes of the cave and the chaotic nature of fire to make the stone come alive. This shifts the entire purpose of the deep cave. It was not a static gallery. It was an active, unnerving theater. They were bringing the monsters of the Ice Age down into the absolute darkness with them, but down here, the humans were in control. By recreating the giant megafauna that ruled the surface, they could study them. They could point out the anatomy and movement of a cave lion to a young hunter without the immediate risk of being slaughtered on the frozen plains. But it went much deeper than just showing children what a mammoth looked like. These painted walls were survival infrastructure. They were the first external hard drives in human history. Scattered among the running beasts and overlapping herds, archaeologists have found hundreds of abstract dots, lines, and Y-shaped marks. For decades, these were dismissed as random scratches. But recent analysis suggests a chillingly brilliant reality. These marks often align with the lunar calendar and the specific mating or birthing seasons of the animals depicted. The ancient humans were recording data. They were tracking when the vast herds of reindeer would migrate, when the giant bison would breed, and when the lethal winter would finally break. Before these cave walls, human knowledge only existed inside the fragile, easily destroyed biological brain of an elder. If a tribe's oldest hunters froze to death in a sudden blizzard, their entire mental map of the world, their knowledge of migrations and seasons, died with them. The tribe would starve. But by encoding their knowledge into the rock, they created a memory that could survive a winter, outlive a generation, and defy death itself. They had figured out how to store information outside their own bodies. It was a massive evolutionary leap, turning the terrifying underworld into an indestructible library of human survival. But despite the moving beasts and the complex data encoded in the stone, the most powerful and haunting images they left in the dark were not the animals they hunted. They were the hands. When you look at the overlapping animals painted on the limestone, you are looking at prehistoric data. You are seeing the ancient world through their eyes. But when you look at the red, glowing handprints scattered among the beasts, the perspective shifts completely. You are no longer looking at what they saw. You are looking directly at them. Think about the physical act of leaving that mark. When an ancient human placed their palm against the freezing, wet stone and blew the red ochre over their skin, they were doing something no animal had ever done in the history of the planet. They were splitting themselves in two. When they pulled their physical hand away from the rock, a second hand remained. A ghost hand. One that did not need to eat, one that could not freeze to death, and one that would never age. For a long time, modern people assumed that crawling into these deep, lethal cave systems was a solitary task. We imagined a lone, male shaman or a brave hunter descending into the dark to perform a secretive ritual before a winter hunt. But modern science has completely shattered that assumption. When researchers measure the specific lengths of the fingers left on these walls, examining the ratio between the index and ring fingers, they discover a shocking demographic reality. A massive percentage of these handprints do not belong to adult men. They belong to women. And tucked beneath the massive, clawed scratch marks of cave bears, there are dozens of handprints belonging to toddlers and infants. This changes everything. It means that the journey into the terrifying, oxygen-deprived blackness was not just a mission for lone warriors, it was a communal necessity. Entire tribes, including young mothers and small children, were deliberately making the treacherous crawl miles underground. They were risking the suffocating smoke, the shifting shadows, and the sensory deprivation together. And they were holding the tiny hands of their children against the freezing walls, blowing metallic dust over them, just to leave a mark. Why take a child into a place so dangerous? Because the Ice Age was a world of sudden, total erasure. In the prehistoric world, death was not a quiet, organized event. It was violent and absolute. A hunter could be crushed by a woolly rhinoceros and left in the snow. A child could succumb to a sudden winter fever and be buried under rocks where wolves would inevitably find them. There were no photographs, no written names, no stone monuments that could survive the crushing weight of a glacier. When you died, the memory of your existence eventually died with the last person who knew you. You simply vanished from the earth. The red handprint was their weapon against disappearing. It was the birth of human identity, and the first time a creature on Earth realized its own mortality and decided to fight back. By leaving their physical outline in the absolute darkness, hidden away from the wind and the snow, they were creating a permanent anchor in a world that was constantly trying to wipe them out. They were saying, "I am here. I exist. I am not just a temporary animal trying to survive until tomorrow." This desperate, physical need to be remembered was not just a coping mechanism. It was a profound psychological mutation, and it changed the trajectory of our species forever. The act of leaving a handprint was a deeply personal rebellion against death, but it triggered something far larger than individual memory. Imagine what happened when that ancient tribe finally turned around. They carried their dying torches back through the narrow, freezing limestone tubes, leaving the suffocating blackness behind, and emerged into the blinding wind of the Ice Age surface. They left the child's red handprint glowing in the absolute dark. The earth swallowed it in silence, completely hiding it from the elements. But then, 50 or even 500 years later, a completely different group of humans, fleeing a sudden, lethal blizzard, crawls down into that exact same cavern. They strike their flint. They light their hollowed-out stones of animal fat. The greasy fire pushes back the shadows, and there, perfectly preserved on the wet rock, is the handprint. They do not know the child. The child has been dead for generations, but they instantly understand what the mark means. They are not the first to seek refuge here. They are not alone in the dark. This moment was the invention of time travel. For the first time in the history of the planet, a thought, an identity, and a piece of critical survival data could be frozen in time and transmitted across hundreds or thousands of years. Before these painted walls, human cooperation was strictly limited by physical presence and biological lifespan. You could only trust the people you could see. You could only learn what your living elders could remember. If a tribe was wiped out by a harsh winter, all of their hard-earned knowledge vanished with them. The deep cave changed the rules of human evolution. By turning the stone walls into external hard drives, ancient people created the first fixed institutions of human history. These terrifying, oxygen-deprived chambers became the first archives, permanently storing the lunar cycles and the migration patterns of the massive reindeer herds. They became the first schools where young hunters stood in the flickering torchlight, inhaling the bitter smoke of burning bone to study the exact anatomy of a massive bison before they ever faced one on the open ice. And because these deep zones were so physically dangerous to reach, they demanded absolute reverence. You do not accidentally wander a mile underground, you prepare for it. The harrowing journey through the dark became a psychological trial. The painted chambers became the first temples. Shared myths began to form around the shifting, animated beasts and the ghostly red hands. These shared stories allowed scattered, desperate bands of humans to realize they belonged to a larger culture. Two rival tribes could meet on the frozen steppes, recognize the same red ochre symbols, and understand that they shared the same underground sanctuaries. This shared imagination is the invisible glue of civilization. It is the exact mechanism that eventually allowed humans to cooperate in massive numbers, to build cities, and to form empires. The foundation of the modern world was not built under the sun. It was forged in the toxic, hallucinatory blackness of the deep cave, where desperate people learned how to make the stone remember. And tens of thousands of years later, long after the ice melted and the giant bears went extinct, we are still driven by that exact same instinct. We live in a world that has entirely conquered the night. You sleep in a temperature-controlled room behind heavy, locking doors. If the shadows in the corner make you uneasy, you can simply reach out and flood your environment with instant artificial light. You carry a glowing screen in your pocket that instantly connects you to the collective knowledge of the entire human race. Modern humans forget how recent comfort really is. We look back at the Ice Age as a primitive, distant nightmare that has absolutely nothing to do with us. But your body has not forgotten. The ancient world did not disappear. It simply became your nervous system. Look at your own daily behavior. What is the defining obsession of the modern era? We spend our entire lives staring into glowing rectangles, even in the dark. We document every meal, every vacation, every milestone, and every stray thought, uploading billions of images into a digital cloud every single day. We tell ourselves this is just communication or entertainment. But beneath the surface of all that technology, you are driven by the exact same psychological mutation that drove an Ice Age mother to drag her toddler miles underground. You are still fighting the sheer terror of being completely erased. Every time you post a photo, every time you leave a digital comment, every time you try to curate your legacy, you are just pressing your hand against the cave wall. You are screaming into the void, saying that you were here, that you mattered, and asking the future not to let you disappear. But this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling. Our modern methods of memory are incredibly fragile. We have traded the brutal permanence of the stone for the temporary convenience of electricity. If the power grid fails, if a solar storm strikes, or if magnetic drives simply degrade over the next century, your entire life archive will vanish in an instant. Your digital ghost is not bonded to the earth. It is an electrical illusion. In just a few hundred years, there may be absolutely no physical proof that you ever existed at all. We are actually leaving a far weaker legacy than the people we call primitive. Think about that. Tens of thousands of years from now, our glass skyscrapers may be shattered and buried under new soil. Our massive data centers will be nothing but rusted metal. The glowing screens will be black glass, and the digital cloud will be entirely silent. But far below the surface of the earth, perfectly hidden from the wind, the changing climate, and the collapse of empires, the deep cave will remain completely unchanged. The temperature will hold steady. The limestone will continue to sweat in the absolute, terrifying silence. And there, frozen perfectly in time, the crushed iron oxide will still be tightly gripping the stone. The red pigment will still hold the biological signature of human saliva and exhausted breath. The small, outstretched hand of an Ice Age child will still be glowing on the wall, waiting patiently for the next flickering torch to find it. Civilization is new. Survival is older. And somewhere deep in the earth, the ancient human is still waiting in the dark,